When Lucius Lucullus took command of the war against Mithridates, he assembled a force from several different armies. He brought one legion from Rome, incorporated the 2 legions that had previously served under Fimbria, and added 2 more. Altogether, his army numbered roughly 30,000 infantry and about 1,600 cavalry. With these troops, he advanced toward Cyzicus, where Mithridates had already established an enormous military presence. The difference in numbers was striking. Reports from deserters suggested that Mithridates commanded close to 300,000 men. Yet the size of this army also created a serious weakness. Such a huge force consumed vast quantities of food, and much of what it needed had to be gathered from the surrounding countryside or transported by sea. Lucullus immediately recognized the opportunity. Rather than challenge Mithridates in a massive battle, he believed he could destroy the Pontic army simply by cutting it off from its supplies. A nearby mountain offered exactly the position Lucullus needed. From there, the Romans could maintain secure communication with their own supply routes while threatening those of Mithridates. The problem was reaching it. A narrow passage controlled access to the area, and Mithridates had stationed a strong force there after his commanders, including Taxiles, warned him of its importance. The situation changed because of Lucius Magius, the Roman who had earlier helped arrange the alliance between Mithridates and Sertorius. With Sertorius now dead, Magius secretly contacted Lucullus and reached an understanding with him. He then persuaded Mithridates that allowing the Romans through the pass would actually benefit the Pontic king. According to Magius, Fimbria's former soldiers were preparing to abandon Lucullus and defect to Mithridates. There was therefore no reason to risk a costly battle when the Roman army might soon collapse from within. Mithridates accepted the argument and made a disastrous mistake. The Romans were permitted to move through the pass without resistance and occupy the commanding heights. Once Lucullus had fortified the position, the strategic situation changed completely. Roman supplies could reach the camp safely from behind, while Mithridates found himself restricted by rivers, mountains, and a lake. Obtaining provisions overland became extremely difficult, and his enormous army was increasingly dependent on shipments arriving by sea. Time also favored Lucullus. Winter was approaching, and worsening weather would eventually make maritime supply unreliable. Mithridates had allowed his enemy to occupy precisely the ground that could slowly strangle his army. Lucullus, who had earlier predicted that he could defeat the king without a major battle, now pointed to the situation as proof that his strategy was already working. Mithridates still possessed overwhelming numerical strength and might have attempted to break through the Roman positions before the blockade became unbearable. Instead, he concentrated on capturing Cyzicus. He seems to have believed that taking the city would solve both his strategic difficulties and his growing supply problem. With enormous manpower available, he committed himself to an exceptionally ambitious siege. The city was surrounded from both land and sea. Mithridates blocked the harbor, dug defensive works around the remaining approaches, and constructed mounds, towers, battering rams, covered siege structures, and other engines. One enormous tower rose approximately 100 cubits and carried another elevated structure from which stones, bolts, and other missiles could rain down upon the defenders. He also prepared an elaborate naval assault. 2 large warships were joined together to support another siege tower. Attached to it was a mechanical bridge that could be extended toward the city walls once the ships moved close enough. The device was designed to place soldiers directly onto the fortifications and bypass the difficult task of forcing an entrance from below. Before launching the main attack, however, Mithridates tried psychological pressure. Around 3,000 people from Cyzicus who had fallen into his hands were placed aboard ships and brought within sight of the walls. They stretched out their hands and begged their fellow citizens to save them. It was an agonizing spectacle intended to weaken the defenders' determination. Pisistratus, the commander responsible for the city's defense, refused to surrender. His answer was harsh but strategically necessary. those prisoners were already under enemy control and would have to endure whatever fate awaited them. Cyzicus could not sacrifice its defenses in an attempt to save people. It no longer had the power to protect. With intimidation unsuccessful, Mithridates began the assault. The floating siege machine moved towards the walls, and its mechanical bridge was suddenly extended onto the fortifications. 4 Pontic soldiers rushed across. The unexpected appearance of attackers directly on the wall initially shocked the defenders, who briefly pulled back. But the rest of the attacking force did not follow quickly enough. That hesitation gave the Cyzicians time to recover. They turned on the 4 isolated soldiers and threw them from the wall. Then they poured burning pitch onto the ships below. Unable to remain in position beneath the flames, the vessels were forced to withdraw, dragging the elaborate siege apparatus away with them. The attack from the sea had failed, but Mithridates immediately intensified the pressure on land. His siege engines were brought forward together, forcing the defenders to race from one threatened section of the walls to another. The assault became a relentless contest between engineering and improvisation as the citizens struggled to neutralize each new weapon directed against them. They smashed the heads of battering rams with heavy stones and used ropes and loops to seize or damage them. Where the rams could not be destroyed, baskets packed with wool were positioned to absorb the impact. Incendiary projectiles were met with water and vinegar, while loosely suspended cloth and linen were used to reduce the force of other missiles. Every available material became part of the city's defense. The fighting continued for hours. Despite the determination of the defenders, repeated attacks and fire eventually weakened part of the fortifications. By evening, a section of the wall collapsed. It appeared that Mithridates had finally created the opening he needed. Yet the breach did not produce the breakthrough he expected. The area was still so intensely heated by the fires that the attackers hesitated to rush through it. That brief delay proved crucial. During the night, the inhabitants of Cyzicus worked rapidly and constructed a new defensive wall behind the damaged section, effectively sealing the opening before the Pontic army could exploit it. Then nature dealt Mithridates another blow. A powerful wind swept across the siege lines and damaged or destroyed many of the remaining siege engines. After enormous preparation, repeated attacks, and the construction of extraordinary machines, the king had still failed to break Cyzicus. Meanwhile, the larger danger remained unresolved. Lucullus continued to hold the strategic heights, the Roman blockade remained intact, and the vast army of Mithridates was consuming supplies that were becoming more difficult to replace with every passing day. According to an old tradition, Cyzicus had once been presented by Zeus to Persephone as part of her marriage gift, and among all the divine powers worshipped in the city, she held a particularly honored place. During the siege, the time arrived for one of her important festivals. The customary sacrifice required a black heifer, but because the city was surrounded and no suitable animal could be found, the inhabitants prepared an imitation from doe instead. Then something extraordinary happened. A living black heifer appeared in the sea and began swimming towards the city. It passed beneath the chain that protected the entrance to the harbor, reached the shore, and made its way through Cyzicus. Without being guided, the animal reportedly went directly to Persephone's sanctuary and stopped beside the altar. The citizens interpreted its arrival as a powerful sign of divine favor and joyfully offered the animal as the traditional sacrifice. News of the event also reached the camp of Mithridates. Some of his companions regarded it as a warning and urged him to abandon the siege, arguing that the city clearly enjoyed divine protection. Mithridates refused. Rather than withdraw, he intensified his efforts to capture Cyzicus and turned his attention to Mount Dindymus, which dominated the surrounding landscape. From the mountain, Mithridates began constructing an enormous artificial embankment towards the city walls. Siege towers were placed upon this structure, while other soldiers attempted to undermine the defenses by digging tunnels beneath them. The operation required enormous labor, but the king remained determined to force his way into Cyzicus despite the worsening condition of his army. His cavalry had become especially difficult to maintain. Horses were of little use in the siege itself, while shortages of fodder had weakened them and damaged their hooves. Mithridates therefore decided to send much of his cavalry and its accompanying personnel toward Bithynia by a longer route, hoping they could escape the supply crisis around Cyzicus. Lucullus was waiting for such an opportunity. He attacked the column while it was attempting to cross the Rhindacus River. The result was devastating for Mithridates. Large numbers were killed, while the Romans reportedly captured around 15,000 men, approximately 6,000 horses, and a considerable number of pack animals. The disaster further reduced Mithridates' ability to operate effectively around Cyzicus. Meanwhile, the conflict was spreading across Asia Minor. Eumachus, one of Mithridates' commanders, launched a destructive campaign through Phrygia. Romans living in the region were killed in large numbers, together with members of their families. Eumachus then extended his operations against the Pisidians and Isaurians and moved into Cilicia, temporarily expanding Pontic influence across a wide area. His success did not last. Diotarus, one of the Galatian tetrarchs, eventually confronted Eumachus and defeated his forces, killing many of his soldiers and forcing the surviving troops away. While Mithridates remained trapped in the increasingly disastrous siege of Cyzicus, his commanders elsewhere were therefore also beginning to encounter determined resistance. Winter finally transformed Mithridates' difficult position into a catastrophe. Sea transport became unreliable, and the flow of supplies to his army virtually disappeared. A force that had once seemed overwhelming was now unable to feed itself. Hunger spread throughout the camp, and soldiers began dying in increasing numbers. Conditions soon became desperate. Some men resorted to eating animal entrails and whatever other scraps they could obtain. Others survived on wild plants, which left many sick and weakened. The growing number of deaths created another danger. Bodies were discarded without proper burial around the camp, and disease began spreading among soldiers already exhausted by starvation. Even then, Mithridates refused to abandon the siege. He continued placing his hopes in the massive works extending from Mount Dindymus towards the city. But the defenders of Cyzicus countered these efforts effectively. They undermined the king's earthworks, destroyed siege machines with fire, and repeatedly launched attacks outside their walls whenever they saw an opportunity. The defenders understood that their enemies were growing weaker every day. Hunger had transformed the enormous Pontic army from a threat into a vulnerable mass of exhausted men. Each Cyzician sortie placed additional pressure on soldiers who were already struggling simply to remain alive. Eventually, even Mithridates had to recognize that the siege could no longer be sustained. He finally decided to escape under cover of darkness. Mithridates himself departed by sea and headed toward Parius, while the main army attempted to withdraw overland toward Lampsacus. The retreat quickly became another disaster. The Aesopus River was heavily swollen, making the crossing extremely dangerous, and Lucullus attacked the fleeing troops while they were struggling to get across. Many were killed or swept away during the chaotic withdrawal. Cyzicus had survived one of the most formidable sieges of the war. Its citizens had resisted siege towers, naval assaults, battering rams, tunnels, fire, and enormous numbers of enemy soldiers. Yet their survival was also made possible by Lucullus's strategy. Instead of throwing his smaller army into a direct confrontation, the Roman commander had systematically deprived Mithridates of food until the king's numerical advantage became a burden. The people of Cyzicus remembered Lucullus as one of the men responsible for their deliverance. Games were established in his honor, known as the Lucullian Games, preserving the memory of the Roman commander and the extraordinary siege long after the immediate danger had passed. The retreating Pontic forces were not yet safe. Some of Mithridates' troops had reached Lampsacus, where Lucullus continued to pressure them. Mithridates sent ships to evacuate these soldiers and also carried away inhabitants of the city. He then divided his remaining forces, leaving approximately 10,000 selected troops and 50 ships under the command of Varius, Alexander the Paphlagonian, and Dionysius, a eunuch serving among his commanders. Mithridates himself sailed with the greater part of his surviving forces toward Nicomedia. But the sea now became almost as dangerous as the Roman army. A violent storm struck the fleets, destroying ships and killing many men. The retreat that had begun with starvation at Cyzicus was becoming a sequence of disasters across both land and sea. Having defeated Mithridates strategically on land, Lucullus now expanded his operations onto the water. He assembled ships from the Roman province of Asia and distributed portions of the fleet among his commanders. The Roman counteroffensive rapidly spread along the coast and into the cities that had remained under Pontic influence. One of Lucullus's officers, Triarius, attacked Apamea and captured the city. Many inhabitants attempted to find safety inside temples, but large numbers were nevertheless killed. Another commander, Barba, seized Prusias at the foot of its mountain and then occupied Nicaea after the Mithridatic garrison abandoned it. Lucullus himself continued hunting the surviving Pontic naval forces. Near the harbor of the Achaeans, he captured 13 enemy ships. He then pursued Varius, Alexander, and Dionysius toward Lemnos, eventually finding them near a barren island associated in tradition with the Greek hero Philoctetes. Ancient visitors were shown an altar there, together with objects said to commemorate the hero and his suffering. Confident after his recent victories, Lucullus initially approached the enemy aggressively. Yet the opposing force maintained a disciplined defense. Rather than recklessly forcing a naval engagement, Lucullus changed tactics. He slowed his advance and began sending ships forward in pairs, attempting to tempt the enemy away from the protection of the shoreline and into open water. The commanders of Mithridates refused to take the bait. They remained close to land and continued defending their position. Lucullus therefore sent part of his fleet around the island, landed infantry from another direction, and forced the enemy back toward their ships. The Pontic troops now found themselves trapped between two threats. Roman soldiers attacked from the land, while Roman ships bombarded them from the sea. They could not remain safely ashore, but they were equally reluctant to sail into open water, where Lucullus controlled the stronger naval position. Missiles struck them from both directions, casualties mounted, and their organized resistance finally collapsed. Varius, Alexander, and Dionysius attempted to hide inside a cave, but were discovered and captured. Dionysius carried poison with him and used it immediately, dying before the Romans could decide his fate. Varius faced a different end. Because he was a Roman senator who had fought on the enemy side, Lucullus did not want the spectacle of publicly displaying a senator as a captive in his triumph. He therefore ordered him executed. Alexander was spared. Lucullus intended to display him later as part of the celebration of his victories. With this campaign completed, the Roman commander sent messages to Rome decorated with laurel, the traditional announcement of military success, and then continued his advance toward Bithynia. Mithridates, meanwhile, attempted to reach Pontus by sea, only to encounter another violent storm. Once again, his forces suffered enormous losses. Ancient accounts place the number of dead at roughly 10,000, while around 60 ships were destroyed and the survivors scattered in different directions by the wind. Even the king's own vessel began taking on water. With his flagship no longer safe, Mithridates was forced to transfer to a small pirate vessel. His companions reportedly considered the decision extremely dangerous and tried to prevent him from boarding, but the desperate situation left few alternatives. The pirates successfully carried him to Sinope. From Sinope he continued to Amissus, where he began urgently searching for new allies and reinforcements. Messages were sent to Tigranes of Armenia, his son-in-law, asking for military assistance. He also appealed to his son Machares, who ruled the Cimmerian Bosporus, hoping that support from his family and allied rulers could restore his shattered position. Mithridates also tried to secure help from neighboring Scythian peoples. A man named Diocles was entrusted with large quantities of gold and valuable gifts intended to persuade them to support the king. Instead, Diocles betrayed him. He took the treasure and deserted to Lucullus, adding yet another humiliation to the series of setbacks suffered by Mithridates. Lucullus now advanced with growing confidence. Resistance collapsed in many places as his army moved through territory that had remained relatively untouched by warfare. The region was so prosperous and supplies became so abundant that prices fell dramatically. Captives, livestock, clothing, and other goods could be purchased for remarkably small sums as the Roman army continued deeper into Pontic-controlled territory. The next major objectives were Amisus and Eupatoria. Eupatoria had been founded beside Amisus by Mithridates himself and named in connection with his royal identity. He had intended it to become an important center of his power, making its defense particularly significant as Lucullus tightened Roman controls over the region. Another Roman force moved against Themyscira, a city situated on the Thermodon River and closely connected in Greek tradition with the Amazons. The siege developed into an extraordinary underground struggle. Roman troops built towers and siege mounds, but they also excavated enormous tunnels beneath the defenses. These underground passages became large enough for actual fighting to occur inside them. The inhabitants responded with unusual methods. They opened holes from above into the Roman tunnels and released bears and other dangerous animals against the soldiers working below. Swarms of bees were also sent into the passages, turning the confined underground battlefield into a terrifying environment for the besiegers. At Amisus, the Romans encountered equally stubborn resistance. The defenders repeatedly drove back attacks, launched sudden sorties against the besieging army, and even challenged Roman soldiers to individual combat. Far from collapsing after the disasters at Cyzicus, the remaining supporters of Mithridates continued to fight aggressively. Mithridates did everything possible to keep Amisus in the war. From Cabira, where he spent the winter, he sent weapons, provisions, and additional soldiers to reinforce the city. At the same time, he began rebuilding his own army after the devastating losses of the previous campaign. Despite everything that had happened at Cyzicus, Mithridates was not yet finished. At Cabira, he managed to gather a new force of approximately 40,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. His enormous army had been shattered by hunger, disease, storms, and Roman pressure. But the king was preparing once again to challenge Lucullus and continue the struggle for control of Asia Minor. When spring arrived, Lucullus resumed the offensive and pushed across the mountains toward Mithridates. The Pontic king had prepared carefully for the Roman advance. Guard posts had been placed along the approaches, and a chain of beacon fires was meant to carry warnings rapidly from one position to another. The commander of this forward defense was Phoenix, a man connected to the royal family. As Lucullus drew closer, Phoenix lit the signal fires exactly as he had been ordered to do. But immediately afterward, he abandoned Mithridates and crossed over to the Romans with the troops under his command. The defection opened the mountain route, allowing Lucullus to continue forward with little resistance. Once through the mountains, the Romans descended toward Cabira. There, however, Mithridates managed to strike back. In a cavalry engagement, the Pontic forces defeated Lucullus and forced him to withdraw once more toward higher ground. During the fighting, Pomponius, Lucullus's cavalry commander, was wounded, captured, and brought before Mithridates. The king asked his prisoner what benefit he could expect if he spared his life. Pomponius answered with remarkable confidence. If Mithridates made peace with Lucullus, he said, he could be of great use. But if the king intended to remain Lucullus's enemy, then there was no reason even to discuss the matter. Some of Mithridates' followers demanded that the Roman be executed, but the king refused, saying that courage should not be punished simply because fortune had turned against it. For several days, Mithridates brought his army out and tried to provoke Lucullus into a major battle. Lucullus would not accept the challenge. He knew that Pontic cavalry remained dangerous on open ground, so he kept his men in the stronger mountain. Position. Mithridates then began searching for a route that would allow him to attack the Romans from above or force them from their defenses. Around this time, a Scythian named Olcaba became involved in a strange episode inside the Roman camp. He had previously deserted Mithridates and joined Lucullus, and during a recent cavalry battle, he had reportedly saved several Roman lives. Because of this, Lucullus had come to trust him and had even allowed him access to his personal circle. One day, Olcaba approached Lucullus's tent while the general was resting at midday. He carried a short dagger, apparently as he normally did, and insisted that he had urgent business requiring immediate access to the commander. Lucullus's attendants refused to wake their general, arguing that nothing was more important than protecting his safety. Olcaba reacted angrily. Whether he had truly intended to attack Lucullus and realized that suspicion had fallen on him, or simply felt humiliated by the refusal, is impossible to know. In any case, he mounted his horse and rode directly back to Mithridates. After reaching the Pontic camp, Olcaba exposed another Scythian named Sobadacus, who had supposedly been considering desertion to Lucullus. Sobadacus was immediately arrested. The incident showed how unstable loyalties had become on both sides, with commanders and soldiers constantly calculating which army seemed most likely to survive. Lucullus still faced a serious tactical problem. He could not safely descend into the open plain because Mithridates possessed far superior cavalry, and at first he could find no alternative route. Eventually, he discovered a hunter living in a cave who knew the hidden paths through the mountains. Using this man as a guide, Lucullus led his army along difficult and indirect tracks and managed to descend beyond the position of Mithridates. Even then, he avoided the open ground as much as possible and selected a camp protected by terrain, placing a mountain stream across his front. The Romans were now in a strong defensive position, but they were short of food. Lucullus depended heavily on grain coming from Cappadocia, and without that supply line, his position could quickly become dangerous. Small clashes continued between the two armies while both commanders looked for a way to gain a decisive advantage. During one of these encounters, Pontic troops initially began to retreat. Mithridates rushed out from his camp, rebuked them, and managed to restore their courage. The counterattack was so sudden that panic spread through the Roman ranks. The Romans fled up the mountain in complete confusion. They ran so quickly that many did not even realize when the enemy stopped pursuing them. Some soldiers mistook the men running behind them for hostile troops, which only increased the disorder. Mithridates treated the episode as a major victory and sent reports of it throughout his territories. He then developed a plan that closely resembled the strategy Lucullus had used against him at Cyzicus. If the Romans could be deprived of supplies, Mithridates reasoned, hunger might force them to retreat, just as it had once destroyed his own army. A large force of elite Pontic cavalry was therefore sent to intercept the Roman supply convoy coming from Cappadocia. The idea was strategically sound. Lucullus relied heavily on this route, and its destruction might have placed his entire army in serious danger. The execution, however, was disastrous. The Pontic cavalry encountered the Roman advance guard while both forces were still inside a narrow defile. Instead of waiting for the convoy to emerge onto open ground, where cavalry would have had every advantage, the Pontic soldiers attacked immediately. The confined terrain neutralized their greatest strength. Horses had little room to maneuver, while the Romans rapidly formed their marching column into a fighting line. In such ground, infantry had the advantage. The Romans killed many of the attackers, drove others over cliffs, and scattered the rest. Only a small number eventually returned to Mithridates' camp after nightfall. Their reports made the disaster seem even worse than it actually was, although the defeat had already been severe enough. Mithridates learned about the destruction of his cavalry before Lucullus himself received the news. He immediately assumed that the Romans would attack as soon as they realized how badly the Pontic mounted forces had been weakened. Fear spread through the king's inner circle. Mithridates quietly told his closest companions that withdrawal might now be necessary. but his friends did not wait for any formal command. While it was still dark, they began hurriedly sending their baggage out of the camp. Soon the exits were jammed with pack animals, servants, carts, and equipment. Ordinary soldiers saw the movement but had received no explanation. They began imagining that some enormous disaster had already occurred, and that their commanders were secretly abandoning them. Panic replaced discipline almost instantly. Angry that nobody had warned them, the soldiers tore down parts of their own defenses and rushed out across the plain. No general was directing the withdrawal, no organized order had been given, and the entire army began dissolving into a chaotic mass of frightened men. Mithridates hurried from his tent and tried to stop them, but nobody listened. He was caught inside the crowd, knocked from his horse, and nearly crushed beneath the fleeing soldiers. After managing to remount, he escaped toward the mountains with only a small number of followers. When Lucullus finally learned that his supply convoy had survived and realized that the Pontic army was collapsing, he immediately sent cavalry after the fugitives. His infantry moved against those still inside or around the abandoned camp. Lucullus ordered his soldiers not to stop for plunder and instead to concentrate on killing the enemy. But discipline weakened as soon as the Romans entered the camp. Everywhere they saw silver vessels, gold objects, expensive clothing, and other valuable property. Many ignored the order and began looting. That greed may have saved Mithridates. Roman soldiers pursuing him caught up with a pack mule carrying gold and cut open its load. When the treasure spilled onto the ground, they stopped to collect it. The delay gave the king enough time to escape. Mithridates reached Comana and from there fled with approximately 2,000 cavalry toward Armenia, hoping to find protection under Tigranes. Yet his reception was colder than he expected. Tigranes did not permit Mithridates to appear before him personally, although he ordered that the fugitive king be treated with royal hospitality on one of his estates. For Mithridates, the situation now looked almost hopeless. Believing that his kingdom might be lost, he sent a eunuch named Bacchus back to the royal palace with a grim command. His sisters, wives, and concubines were to be killed rather than risk falling into Roman hands. The women died in different ways. Some were stabbed, some were poisoned, and others were hanged. Their deaths marked one of the darkest moments in the collapse of Mithridates' power. When Pontic garrison commanders learned what was happening, most decided that further resistance was pointless. With only a few exceptions, they surrendered their cities to Lucullus. The Roman commander moved rapidly through the region, reorganizing the towns that had submitted. He then turned toward the Black Sea coast and captured several important cities, including Amastris and Heraclea. Sinope proved more difficult. The city continued to resist fiercely and even achieved some success in fighting Lucullus at sea. But once the siege tightened, the defenders realized they could no longer hold out. They burned their heavier vessels, boarded smaller and faster ships, and escaped by sea. Lucullus entered Sinope and decided to grant the city its freedom. A story later connected this decision with a dream. According to tradition, Autolycus, a companion of Hercules during the expedition against the Amazons, had once been driven by a storm to Sinope and had become associated with the city's early history. A sacred statue of him was preserved there and was believed to give prophetic guidance. When the inhabitants fled, they did not have enough time to take the statue. Instead, they wrapped it in cloth and ropes and left it behind. Lucullus supposedly knew nothing about the image. Yet during the night he dreamed that Autolycus appeared before him and called out to him. The next day he saw men carrying a wrapped object through the city and ordered them to uncover it. When the coverings were removed, Lucullus believed he was looking at the same figure he had seen in his dream. The episode reinforced his decision to treat Sinope with unusual generosity. After Sinope, Lucullus also turned his attention to Amisus. Many inhabitants had fled from the city by sea during the fighting, but he ordered them to return. He had learned that Amisus possessed an old connection with Athens. According to the historical tradition known to him, Athenian settlers had established themselves there during the period of Athenian maritime power. The city had originally possessed democratic institutions, but over time it came under Persian authority. Its democracy was later restored under Alexander, only for Amisus eventually to fall under the kings of Pontus. Lucullus viewed this Athenian connection with sympathy. Wanting to imitate the favor Alexander had once shown communities associated with Athens, he granted Amisus its freedom and invited the displaced citizens to return as quickly as possible. Thus, cities that had recently been emptied by siege and flight began to receive their inhabitants again. Lucullus combined military conquest with political reconstruction, presenting Roman victory as a restoration of local freedom rather than simple occupation. His growing success also affected Mithridates' own family. Machaerus, the king's son and ruler of the Bosporus, abandoned his father's cause and opened friendly relations with Lucullus. As a gesture of submission, he sent the Roman commander a golden crown. Lucullus now demanded that Tigranes surrender Mithridates. The conflict was therefore beginning to move beyond Pontus itself and toward Armenia, where the fugitive king had sought refuge. For the moment, however, Lucullus returned to the Roman province of Asia. The region still owed a large portion of the financial penalty previously imposed by Sulla. Lucullus introduced measures to collect the remaining money. A 25% charge was placed on agricultural production, while additional taxes were levied on slaves and property. Having crushed Mithridates' forces around Cabira, taken control of much of Pontus, recovered important coastal cities, and driven the king into exile, Lucullus behaved as though the war were essentially finished. He offered sacrifices to the gods in celebration of his success. Yet Mithridates was still alive, and Tigranes had not surrendered him. What appeared to be the end of the campaign would soon open an entirely new stage of the war. After completing his sacrifices, Lucullus opened a new phase of the war. Mithridates had escaped into Armenia, and Tigranes had refused Roman demands to hand him over. Lucullus therefore decided to invade Armenian territory directly. He took only a carefully selected force with him, 2 veteran legions supported by around 500 cavalry, and crossed the Euphrates. As the Romans advanced, Lucullus avoided unnecessary destruction. The communities along his route showed little desire to become involved in the struggle between Rome and Armenia. Rather than forcing them into open resistance, he simply demanded food and other essential supplies. Most preferred to cooperate and wait to see whether Lucullus or Tigranes would emerge victorious. Tigranes initially had no idea how serious the danger was. Earlier, when someone had reported that Lucullus was advancing, the king had treated the warning as an attempt to create panic and had the messenger executed. The result was predictable. Others became afraid to bring him bad news, and valuable time was lost before he finally learned that a Roman army really was approaching. Once the truth could no longer be ignored, Tigranes sent Mithrobarzanes with about 2,000 cavalry to slow the Roman advance. At the same time, he placed the defense of Tigranocerta in the hands of Mancaeus. Tigranocerta was more than an ordinary fortress. Tigranes had created it as a monumental royal capital and had forced large numbers of people from the surrounding regions to settle there. Those who resisted relocation risked losing their property. The city was enclosed by enormous walls, reportedly around 50 cubits high, with spaces in the lower structures used as stables. The royal complex outside the main defenses was equally ambitious. Tigranes had constructed a palace surrounded by extensive gardens, artificial lakes, hunting grounds, and other symbols of royal wealth. A powerful fortress stood nearby, making the entire area a display of the king's growing imperial ambitions. Lucullus quickly defeated the force under Mithrobarzanes and continued his advance. Sextilius, one of his commanders, was sent against Tigranocerta. He confined Mancaeus inside the city, seized and plundered the relatively unprotected palace, dug defensive lines around both the city and the nearby fortress, and began attacking the walls with siege engines and underground works. Meanwhile, Tigranes gathered what appeared to be an overwhelming army. ancient accounts give enormous figures, roughly 250,000 infantry and 50,000 cavalry. Even if such numbers were exaggerated, the Armenian king clearly possessed a force vastly larger than the one Lucullus had brought across the Euphrates. Before confronting the Romans directly, Tigranes sent around 6,000 cavalry toward Tigranocerta. These horsemen broke through the Roman positions, reached the royal quarters, and successfully removed the king's concubines before withdrawing again. The main Armenian army then advanced toward Lucullus. By this time, Mithridates was finally allowed into Tigranes' presence and offered advice based on his own painful experience. He warned the Armenian king not to fight the Romans in a straightforward, pitched battle. Instead, Mithridates recommended using cavalry to circle around Lucullus, destroy the surrounding countryside, disrupt his supply lines, and gradually starve the Roman army. He knew exactly how effective this method could be because Lucullus had used it against him at Cyzicus, where hunger and exhaustion had destroyed a huge army without the Romans needing to win a major battle. Tigranes dismissed the advice. Confident in the size of his army, he believed the Romans could simply be overwhelmed. When he saw how small Lucullus's force appeared, he reportedly joked that if the Romans had come as diplomats, there were far too many of them, but if they had come as soldiers, there were far too few. Lucullus, however, was already studying the ground. He noticed a hill behind the Armenian position that offered a decisive tactical advantage. His plan was to make Tigranes believe the Romans were preparing a conventional frontal engagement while secretly positioning infantry on the heights. Roman cavalry moved forward, harassed the Armenian troops, and then deliberately withdrew. The retreat encouraged Tigranes' men to pursue. As they pressed forward, their formations became increasingly disordered. While this was happening, Lucullus led his infantry around towards the hill and occupied it without attracting much attention. From the elevated position he could see the Armenian army stretching below him, its pursuing forces scattered, and its enormous baggage train exposed near the base of the slope. Recognizing the opportunity, Lucullus told his soldiers that victory was already theirs. He then launched his attack downhill, targeting the baggage train first. The effect was immediate. Camp followers and baggage handlers fled in panic and crashed into the Armenian infantry. The infantry, suddenly thrown into confusion, collided with the cavalry. The army's enormous size, which Tigranes had regarded as its greatest strength, now worked against it. At the same time, Roman cavalry that had been retreating turned and attacked its pursuers. Disorder spread from one part of the Armenian force to another. Many soldiers had no idea where the attack was coming from or which direction offered safety. The retreat quickly became a rout. Men, horses, baggage animals, and equipment became mixed together in a dense, chaotic mass. Roman soldiers continued the pursuit for a considerable distance. Lucullus had issued strict orders against stopping to loot during the battle. Valuable ornaments, jewelry, and other objects lay scattered along the route of the retreat, but the Romans were expected to ignore them and continue killing and pursuing the enemy. Only after nightfall did Lucullus finally allow his soldiers to return and collect the abandoned wealth. The defeat outside Tigranocerta completely transformed the situation inside the city. Mancaeus became suspicious of the Greek mercenaries serving in the garrison and ordered them disarmed. The mercenaries immediately realized that arrest or execution might follow. They stayed together for protection and armed themselves with clubs. When Mancaeus sent armed troops against them, they improvised shields by wrapping clothing around their left arms and charged their attackers. Every enemy soldier they killed gave them access to better weapons. As the fighting continued, the Greeks gradually armed themselves with captured equipment. Eventually, they seized sections of the defenses between the towers and called out to the Romans outside. Once Lucullus's troops approached, the mercenaries opened the way for them. Tigranocerta fell from within. The Romans entered the city and found enormous quantities of wealth, exactly what might be expected from a newly constructed royal capital designed to demonstrate the power and luxury of Tigranes. The loss of the city did not end the war. Tigranes and Mithridates moved through Armenia trying to assemble another army. This time, Tigranes gave Mithridates an important role in its organization. After so many defeats, he apparently believed that the Pontic king had learned valuable lessons about Roman methods. Both kings also looked eastward for support and sent representatives to the Parthian court. Lucullus responded by sending his own envoys, urging the Parthian ruler either to join Rome or at least remain neutral. The Parthian king avoided committing himself openly. He reached private understandings with both sides and showed little enthusiasm for risking his own army in the struggle. Mithridates, meanwhile, began a massive program of recruitment and reorganization throughout Armenia. Weapons were manufactured in different towns, and large numbers of men were called into service. From this larger population, he selected what he considered the most capable troops, perhaps around 70,000 infantry and roughly half as many cavalry. The remaining recruits were dismissed. The new army was reorganized in formations modeled as closely as possible on Roman military practice. Mithridates divided the troops into units resembling Roman cohorts and cavalry squadrons and placed Pontic officers over them for training. When Lucullus moved toward the rebuilt army, Mithridates placed his infantry and some cavalry on a hill and refused to be drawn into a reckless engagement. Tigranes took the remaining cavalry and attacked Roman troops who were gathering supplies. This attack ended badly for the Armenians. Tigranes was defeated, and afterward Roman soldiers were able to forage with far greater confidence, sometimes operating dangerously close to Mithridates' own position. Soon another large cloud of dust revealed that Tigranes was approaching once more. The two kings apparently intended to coordinate their movements and surround Lucullus. Lucullus reacted before their plan could develop. He sent his best cavalry far forward with orders to strike Tigranes, while the Armenian forces were still arriving, and prevent them from forming a proper battle line. At the same time, he challenged Mithridates to come down and fight. When Mithridates refused, Lucullus began constructing defensive works around his position, hoping to restrict him further. Neither side could force a decisive result. Winter eventually arrived and brought large-scale operations to a halt. Tigranes withdrew deeper into Armenia. Mithridates saw an opportunity to return to the remnants of his own kingdom in Pontus. He moved rapidly with around 4,000 of his own troops and approximately the same number supplied by Tigranes. Lucullus followed, but he too was struggling with shortages of food and could not move as freely as he wished. Before he could intercept Mithridates, the Pontic king struck at Fabius, a Roman commander Lucullus had left behind. Mithridates defeated him and killed about 500 Roman soldiers. Fabius responded desperately by freeing the slaves in his camp and using them as additional manpower. Fighting continued for the remainder of the day. The Romans were still under heavy pressure when Mithridates himself was wounded. A stone struck his knee, and an arrow or dart hit him beneath the eye. The king was removed from the battlefield immediately. His sudden disappearance created alarm throughout the Pontic army, and for several days there was serious concern that he might die. The Romans were in little condition to exploit the situation. They too had suffered heavily and remained relatively inactive while Mithridates recovered. His treatment was reportedly handled by the Agari, a Scythian people who accompanied him and were famous for using substances derived from snake venom in medicine. Under their care, Mithridates recovered from his injuries. Another Roman commander, Triarius, soon arrived to reinforce Fabius. He took over both the army and its authority, preparing for another confrontation with Mithridates. Before long, the two sides met again. But during the fighting, an extraordinary storm erupted. Powerful winds tore down tents in both camps, carried away pack animals, and reportedly hurled some men over nearby cliffs. The violence of the weather forced both armies to disengage temporarily. Then word arrived that Lucullus himself was approaching. Triarius feared that the senior commander would arrive and take control of the campaign before he could win a major victory of his own. Determined to act first, Triarius launched a pre-dawn attack against the forward positions of Mithridates. The battle remained uncertain for a long time. Eventually, Mithridates concentrated his strength against the Roman troops directly opposing him and broke their formation. The Roman infantry was driven into muddy ground where movement became extremely difficult. Unable to maintain their footing or preserve an organized line, many were slaughtered. Mithridates then pursued the Roman cavalry across the plain, pressing the advantage with remarkable energy. For a moment it seemed that he had achieved one of his greatest victories of the war. Then a Roman centurion managed to get close to the king by pretending to be one of his attendants. Knowing that Mithridates' body armor made an attack from behind difficult, the centurion struck him hard in the thigh with a sword. The men around Mithridates immediately killed the attacker, but the damage had been done. The king was carried away from the front. His commanders, terrified by the injury, ordered the army to withdraw from a battle it had been winning. The sudden recall created confusion among the troops because many assumed some unknown disaster had occurred elsewhere. When they discovered that Mithridates had been wounded, soldiers crowded around him in anxiety. His physician Timotheus managed to stop the bleeding and then raised the king so that the army could see that he was still alive. The sight restored morale. The episode was later compared to the famous moment when Alexander the Great showed himself to his worried Macedonian soldiers after suffering a serious wound in India. Once Mithridates recovered enough to understand what had happened, he was furious that the army had been called back. He criticized those responsible and ordered his soldiers forward again that same day. But by then the Romans had already abandoned their camp and fled. The scale of their defeat became clear when the dead were examined. Among them were 24 military tribunes and around 150 centurions, an exceptionally high number of Roman officers to lose in a single battle. Mithridates then withdrew into the region later known to the Romans as Lesser Armenia. As he moved, he collected whatever food he could transport and destroyed what he had to leave behind. The purpose was simple. Lucullus would have to follow through the same territory, and Mithridates wanted to leave nothing that could feed the pursuing Roman army. During this period, another threat emerged from inside the king's own circle. A Roman senator named Attidius, who had fled Roman justice and spent years close to Mithridates, was discovered participating in a conspiracy against him. Mithridates sentenced Attidius to death. Because he had once held senatorial rank, however, the king spared him torture. The other conspirators received far harsher treatment and were subjected to brutal punishment. The freedmen who had known about the plot were allowed to go unharmed because Mithridates concluded that they had merely obeyed their former master. Lucullus, meanwhile, had moved close to Mithridates once again, but events in Rome were beginning to destroy his command from within. Representatives from the Roman administration in Asia announced that Lucullus had been accused of deliberately extending the war longer than necessary. Orders had arrived requiring soldiers under his command to leave military service. Those who ignored the decree risked having their property confiscated. The effect was immediate. Most of the army abandoned Lucullus. Only a relatively small number remained with him, largely men who owned so little that the threat of confiscation meant almost nothing to them. After years of victories, sieges, invasions, and long marches across Asia Minor and Armenia, Lucullus had reached a strange turning point. Mithridates had repeatedly lost armies and kingdoms, yet continued to recover, while Lucullus, despite defeating both Mithridates and Tigranes in major campaigns, was now losing the very army he needed to finish the war. Lucullus had won major victories against Mithridates, but his campaign ended without producing a final settlement. In that sense, his war resembled the earlier Roman struggles against the Pontic king. Rome had defeated Mithridates repeatedly, yet had still failed to remove him permanently from the conflict. At the same time, Rome was facing serious problems elsewhere. Political unrest in Italy continued to demand attention, while piracy across the Mediterranean threatened the food supply of the capital. With grain shipments becoming increasingly insecure, Roman leaders had little desire to begin another enormous eastern campaign before the crisis at sea had been brought under control. Mithridates understood the situation perfectly. Taking advantage of Rome's distraction, he returned to Cappadocia and began strengthening what remained of his kingdom. The Romans did little to stop him because their immediate priority was the Mediterranean. Once the pirate problem had finally been dealt with, however, Roman attention returned to Mithridates. Pompey, the commander responsible for defeating the pirates, was still in Asia when he received command of the renewed war against Pontus. His campaign against piracy therefore became the direct introduction to the final stage of Rome's struggle with Mithridates. The pirate crisis had developed gradually. Years earlier, when Mithridates first invaded the Roman province of Asia, he understood that his control of the region might not last forever. While Sulla was occupied with the war in Greece, Mithridates encouraged extensive plundering and helped unleash raiders across the eastern Mediterranean. At first, these pirates operated much like small coastal gangs. They used light vessels, attacked isolated communities, seized whatever they could carry, and disappeared before organized resistance could reach them. But the longer the wars continued, the more powerful the pirates became. Their small boats were replaced by larger warships, and scattered bands evolved into organized fleets. The rewards were enormous, and piracy soon became more than a temporary means of survival. Even after Mithridates suffered defeat and temporarily made peace with Rome, the pirates did not disappear. Many had lost their homes, farms, or previous livelihoods during the years of warfare. With little reason to return to ordinary life, they turned permanently toward the sea. Their organization became increasingly sophisticated. They sailed under experienced commanders, operated in squadrons, and began behaving less like robbers and more like independent military forces. Unfortified towns were easy targets, but even defended settlements were no longer safe. Pirate groups could conduct proper sieges, undermine walls, batter gates, and capture communities by force. Wealthy prisoners were especially valuable. Instead of simply killing them, the pirates transported them to hidden bases and demanded enormous ransoms from their families. As their confidence increased, they rejected the language of ordinary crime. They no longer considered themselves thieves. What they seized, they described as legitimate spoils of war. Their bases began to resemble military and industrial centers. Skilled craftsmen were captured and forced to work, while timber, bronze, iron, rope, sails, and other materials were collected constantly for the construction of ships and weapons. Success transformed their ambitions. Pirate leaders began imagining themselves as rulers rather than fugitives. With thousands of armed followers, fleets of warships, fortified bases, and enormous wealth, some apparently believed that a united pirate confederation could become almost impossible for Rome to defeat. Their strongest region developed along the rough southern coast of Asia Minor, particularly in Cilicia Trachea, or rough Cilicia. The landscape was ideal for piracy. Steep mountains rose close to the sea. The coastline contained hidden anchorages and difficult approaches, and nearby islands offered additional places of refuge. Because so many pirate groups gathered there, Romans increasingly referred to them collectively as Cilicians, even though they came from many different regions. Some were probably native to rough Cilicia itself, but others came from Syria, Cyprus, Pamphylia, Pontus, and elsewhere across the eastern Mediterranean. The decades of warfare surrounding Mithridates had displaced large numbers of men, and many discovered that piracy offered more opportunity than remaining victims of armies on land. Within a remarkably short time, their numbers grew into the tens of thousands. Their influence then spread far beyond the eastern Mediterranean. Pirate fleets appeared throughout the sea, eventually operating from the Levant all the way toward the western entrance of the Mediterranean near the Pillars of Hercules. Roman naval forces were not always able to stop them. Pirate fleets even defeated Roman commanders in direct engagements, including a Roman praetor near Sicily. Commercial shipping became dangerous almost everywhere, Merchants hesitated to sail, grain transport was disrupted, and coastal agriculture also suffered because markets and maritime connections were no longer reliable. Rome felt the consequences more severely than most cities. The capital depended heavily on imported food because of its enormous population. When maritime trade broke down, shortages rapidly became a political crisis. Yet eliminating the pirates seemed extremely difficult. Rome was not fighting a conventional state with a capital, a fixed army, and territory that could simply be conquered. The enemy possessed no single center whose capture would end the war. Pirate bands could hide among islands, mountain coves, coastal settlements, and remote fortresses. When threatened in one region, they could disappear and reappear somewhere else. This flexibility made traditional Roman campaigning ineffective. Earlier commanders such as Murena achieved little, and even Servilius Esoricus, despite conducting operations against the pirate strongholds, failed to eliminate the wider problem. The pirates became increasingly bold. They began attacking the Italian coastline itself, raiding areas near Brundusium and Etruria. Their victims included members of prominent Roman families. Some aristocratic women were kidnapped while traveling, and even Roman praetors were captured together with the symbols of their public office. For Rome, the issue had now become more than economic. It was a humiliation. The most powerful state in the Mediterranean could no longer guarantee safe travel along its own shores. By 67 BC, the situation had become intolerable. The Romans turned to Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, who was already one of the most famous commanders of his generation. A special law granted Pompey extraordinary authority for 3 years. His command covered the entire Mediterranean within the Pillars of Hercules and extended far inland from the coastline. The scale of the assignment was unprecedented. Kings, cities, communities, and allied rulers throughout the Mediterranean world were instructed to cooperate with him. Pompey was authorized to recruit soldiers, collect money from the provinces, assemble fleets, and draw upon Roman manpower on an enormous scale. The resources placed at his disposal reflected how seriously Rome regarded the crisis. He eventually commanded roughly 120,000 infantry, around 4,000 cavalry, and approximately 270 ships of different types. He also received an enormous financial reserve, reportedly reaching 6,000 Attic talents. But Pompey's greatest strength was not simply the size of his forces, it was the way he organized them. Instead of chasing pirate fleets randomly across thousands of kilometers of coastline, he divided the Mediterranean into separate operational zones. 25 senatorial commanders served under him as legates. Each received ships, infantry, cavalry, and authority within a particular region. The purpose was to prevent exactly what had frustrated earlier Roman commanders. Pirates could no longer escape one Roman squadron only to find safety in another part of the sea. Every zone was watched. If pirates fled from one commander, another force would already be positioned along their likely escape route. Pompey remained above the entire system, moving between regions and coordinating the campaign as a whole. In the far west, Tiberius Nero and Manlius Torquatus were assigned responsibility for Spain and the waters near the Pillars of Hercules. Marcus Pomponius received the coasts of Gaul and Liguria. Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, and nearby islands were placed under other commanders, while separate forces protected the Italian coastline. Sicily and the Adriatic were covered by additional Roman squadrons. Further east, other commanders controlled the Peloponnese, Attica, Euboea, Thessaly, Macedonia, Boeotia, the Aegean Islands, the Hellespont, Bithynia, Thrace, the Propontis, and the entrance to the Black Sea. Lycia, Pamphylia, Cyprus, and Phoenicia were also placed under dedicated Roman commands. The entire Mediterranean had effectively been transformed into a coordinated military grid. This structure allowed Roman forces to remain in position instead of being pulled endlessly from one coast to another. Pirate groups could be pursued without forcing every commander to abandon his own sector. Pompey first inspected the western regions personally. In roughly 40 days, the western Mediterranean had been largely secured. He then passed through Rome and traveled eastward from Brundusium, completing a similar inspection of the eastern commands with astonishing speed. The psychological effect was immediate. The pirates had expected a difficult and prolonged struggle. Some may even have hoped to attack Roman forces before the new system became fully operational. Instead, they suddenly discovered Roman fleets and armies appearing across the entire Mediterranean at once. Many abandoned attacks already underway and retreated toward their traditional strongholds. The open sea became safer with remarkable speed. In many regions, Pompey's subordinate commanders defeated or dispersed the pirate groups before Pompey himself ever needed to fight them directly. The final concentration of resistance lay in Cilicia. Pompey headed there expecting the hardest part of the campaign. He brought a mixed force and extensive siege equipment because he assumed the mountain fortresses of rough Cilicia would require difficult assaults. But by the time he arrived, the pirates' confidence had largely collapsed. Pompey's reputation, combined with the sheer scale of Roman preparations, had convinced many that continued resistance was pointless. The major strongholds at Cragus and Anticragus were among the first to surrender. Other mountain communities followed. Soon pirate groups across Cilicia began submitting one after another. The Romans captured enormous quantities of military equipment. Finished weapons were handed over, along with weapons still being manufactured. Ships already at sea were surrendered, while vessels still under construction were seized in their shipyards. Large stores of bronze, iron, timber, sailcloth, rope, and other naval materials also fell into Roman hands. Perhaps most important were the prisoners. Thousands of people had been held for ransom or forced to work as craftsmen and laborers. Pompey released them and attempted to send them back to their original homes. Some returned only to discover that their families had long assumed them dead. Memorials had even been erected for people who suddenly appeared alive years after their disappearance. Pompey did not treat every captured pirate in the same way. He recognized that many had entered piracy not because they had always been criminals, but because prolonged warfare had destroyed their livelihoods. Instead of executing all of them, he attempted to reintegrate many into settled communities. Former pirates were relocated to towns such as Malus, Adana, and Epiphania, along with other thinly populated settlements in Cilicia. Some were even sent to Dyme in Achaia. The idea was simple. Men who possessed land, families, and a permanent place in society would have less reason to return to piracy. A campaign that Rome had expected to become long and extremely difficult therefore ended with astonishing speed. Pompey's organization had turned the pirates' greatest advantage, their mobility, into a weakness by denying them safe routes of escape. By the conclusion of the operation, Roman forces had captured 71 pirate ships in battle and received the surrender of more than 300 others. Around 120 pirate towns, fortresses, bases, and other gathering places were taken or submitted. Ancient accounts also claim that approximately 10,000 pirates were killed during the fighting. In only a short period, a network that had terrorized Mediterranean shipping, disrupted trade, threatened Rome with hunger, defeated Roman commanders, and kidnapped members of the Roman elite had been broken. The victory dramatically strengthened Pompey's reputation. More importantly, it left him with a powerful army, enormous prestige, and a military command already positioned in the eastern Mediterranean. And waiting beyond Cilicia was another unfinished problem. Mithridates had returned, Pontus remained unsettled, and Rome's long eastern war was about to pass into Pompey's hands. Pompey's destruction of the pirate threat was so rapid that it transformed his position in Roman politics almost overnight. While he was still operating in Cilicia, Rome entrusted him with yet another extraordinary command, the final war against Mithridates. His authority was even broader than before. He could make war or peace, determine which rulers and peoples would be treated as allies or enemies, and command Roman forces throughout the territories beyond Italy. Never before had so much independent military power been concentrated in the hands of a single Roman commander. With the Mediterranean secured, Pompey gathered his troops and advanced toward the remaining lands controlled by Mithridates. The Pontic king had assembled roughly 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry near the frontier, but his position was already difficult. Lucullus had devastated much of the surrounding countryside during the earlier campaigns, leaving the region short of food. Hunger began damaging Mithridates' army before Pompey even forced a major battle. Soldiers deserted in increasing numbers. The king reacted brutally whenever fugitives were caught. Some were crucified, others blinded, and others burned alive. Fear reduced desertion to some extent, but punishment could not create food, and the army continued to weaken from shortages. Recognizing the danger, Mithridates sent representatives to ask Pompey what conditions Rome would accept for peace. Pompey's response left little room for negotiation. Mithridates would have to surrender completely and return the Roman deserters serving in his army. When the king informed those deserters of Pompey's demand, panic spread among them. Mithridates immediately tried to reassure them. He publicly swore that he would never hand them over and declared that Roman greed made a genuine peace impossible. Whatever decision he made, he said, would have to serve the interests of everyone fighting beside him. Pompey then began testing the Pontic defenses. He hid part of his cavalry and sent another force forward to provoke Mithridates' outposts. The Romans attacked briefly and then deliberately withdrew, giving the impression that they had been repulsed. Pontic troops pursued them directly into the trap. Once they had passed the concealed Romans, Pompey's hidden cavalry struck from behind and threw them into confusion. For a moment, the Romans appeared capable of entering the Pontic camp together with the retreating soldiers. Mithridates recognized the danger in time and brought his infantry forward, forcing Pompey's cavalry to pull back. It was only a limited encounter, but it gave both commanders their first direct measure of each other. Mithridates soon abandoned the frontier. Supplies were becoming too scarce, and he hoped that by retreating through already devastated territory, he could force Pompey to suffer from the same hunger that was weakening his own army. Pompey had anticipated exactly that problem. Instead of relying entirely on the countryside, he arranged for supplies to follow his advance. He then moved around Mithridates' eastern side and began constructing a series of fortified positions around him. These camps and posts formed an enormous encircling network, extending over a considerable distance. Gradually, the Romans tightened the ring. Mithridates' ability to forage disappeared, and food became even harder to obtain. Strangely, the Pontic king did little to prevent Pompey from completing these works. Whether he was intimidated, uncertain, or simply unable to decide upon a response, he allowed the Romans to strengthen the blockade around him. The supply crisis soon became severe enough that Mithridates began slaughtering his pack animals for food. Only the horses necessary for military purposes were kept alive. Eventually, his remaining provisions were said to be enough for no more than about 50 days. The king decided that the encirclement had to be broken. Under cover of darkness, his army silently abandoned the position and moved through difficult roads, hoping to escape before Pompey realized what had happened. Pompey discovered the withdrawal and pursued. It took time to catch the fleeing army, but during daylight, the Romans finally reached the Pontic rearguard and attacked it. Mithridates' companions once again urged him to stop and offer battle. He refused. Instead, he used his cavalry to delay the Romans while continuing the retreat. By evening, he reached heavily wooded ground and disappeared into it. On the following day, Mithridates occupied a much stronger position. Rocky terrain protected the camp, and only one main route gave access to it. 4 cohorts were placed forward to guard this approach. The Romans stationed troops opposite them, hoping to prevent another escape. At dawn, both armies prepared for combat. Fighting began among the advance guards on the slope. Some Pontic cavalrymen who happened to be away from their horses saw their comrades under pressure and rushed forward without waiting for orders. More Roman cavalry appeared. Realizing they could not fight effectively on foot the Pontic horsemen turned and ran uphill toward the camp to recover their mounts. From above, however, the rest of Mithridates' army saw only men rushing back toward them in confusion and shouting. They did not understand what had happened. Within seconds, a false impression spread that the forward troops had been defeated and that the Romans had already broken through. Panic exploded across the position. Soldiers threw down their weapons and began running before anyone could restore order. The narrow and rocky ground made escape almost impossible. Men collided with one another, blocked the few available paths, and pushed desperately toward the edges. Some fell or deliberately jumped from cliffs in an attempt to escape the crush. Pompey suddenly found himself facing an army that had largely defeated itself before he even launched a full assault. Roman troops moved into the chaos, killing and capturing men who were still unprepared for battle and trapped in the confined terrain. Around 10,000 Pontic soldiers were reportedly killed, and Pompey captured the camp together with its equipment and supplies. Mithridates managed to escape once again. Accompanied at first only by his bodyguard, he forced his way through the rocky terrain and eventually encountered a group of mercenary cavalry and roughly 3,000 infantry willing to continue with him. Together they reached the fortress of Cynarex, where Mithridates had previously stored a large reserve of money. There he rewarded those who had remained loyal and gave them the equivalent of a year's pay. He then took an enormous amount of treasure, traditionally placed at around 6,000 talents, and moved toward the upper Euphrates. His intention was no longer simply to hold Pontus. He planned to escape through the Caucasian regions and reach Colchis. Mithridates moved at remarkable speed. Within about 4 days he crossed the Euphrates. After several more days he reorganized and armed the forces that had accompanied him or joined him along the way. He then entered Armenia through Chotane. Local peoples, including Chotanians and Iberians, attempted to block his passage with missiles and slings. Mithridates forced his way through them and continued toward the Apsarus River. Ancient writers were already uncertain about the relationship between the Iberians of the Caucasus and those of the far western Mediterranean. Some believed one population descended from the other, while others thought the similarity was only in the name, since their customs and languages appeared different. Mithridates eventually reached Dioscurius in Colchis, where he spent the winter. The city was traditionally associated with Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, who were believed to have traveled through the region during the expedition of the Argonauts. It was here that Mithridates developed one of the most extraordinary plans of his entire career. He was now a fugitive who had lost another army and been driven from his kingdom, yet he still refused to consider the war finished. Instead of surrendering, he imagined traveling around the eastern and northern shores of the Black Sea, crossing through Scythian territories, reaching the Sea of Azov, and entering the Bosporan kingdom. There he intended to remove his own son Machares from power. Machares had sided with Rome, an act Mithridates regarded as betrayal. Once the Bosporus was recovered, Mithridates envisioned launching an entirely new war from Europe. His idea was to attack the Romans from the opposite side of the Black Sea, while their main forces remained concentrated in Asia. The Bosporus itself would separate the two sides and provide him with a new strategic base. Ancient tradition connected the name of this strait with the story of Io, who was said to have crossed it after being transformed into a cow while fleeing the jealousy of Hera. To anyone else, Mithridates' plan might have appeared impossible. To him, it was simply the next stage of the war. He began moving north through unfamiliar and often dangerous territory. Some Scythian peoples permitted him to pass peacefully. Others had to be intimidated or defeated. Despite his losses, Mithridates' reputation remained formidable enough that many communities still treated him with respect. The Heniochi welcomed him, and other people identified as Achaeans resisted and were defeated. Tradition claimed that these Achaeans descended from Greeks who had been blown into the Black Sea while returning from the Trojan War. According to the story, they suffered badly in the region and later developed a hatred of Greeks after their homeland refused to help them return. They were said to have sacrificed captured Greeks according to Scythian customs, at first killing all of them, later only particularly handsome prisoners, and eventually only a smaller number selected by lot. Mithridates continued through these northern regions until he reached the lands around the Sea of Azov. The area was divided among numerous local rulers. Many of them received Mithridates warmly, escorted him through their territories, and exchanged gifts with him. His earlier empire had collapsed, but the fame surrounding his decades of resistance to Rome still gave him considerable influence. He began forming alliances with these rulers and thinking about campaigns even more ambitious than simply recovering the Bosporus. One proposal imagined marching through Thrace into Macedonia, then westward through Pannonia, crossing the Alps, and finally invading Italy itself. Mithridates strengthened his relationships with some of the more powerful local princes by arranging marriages between them and his daughters. His son Machares soon learned that his father had survived and completed this astonishing journey through the northern Black Sea region. Machares sent envoys attempting to justify his earlier cooperation with Rome. He claimed that circumstances had forced him to seek Roman friendship, but he understood his father's character well enough to doubt that any explanation would save him. He fled towards the Chersonesus and burned his own ships behind him so that Mithridates could not easily follow. His efforts failed. Mithridates acquired other vessels and sent men after him. Rather than wait to be captured, Machares killed himself. When Mithridates regained control of the area, he punished those of his own officials whom he believed had betrayed their responsibilities during his absence. By contrast, he spared the associates of Machares, apparently reasoning that they had acted from personal loyalty to his son rather than direct hostility toward him. While Mithridates was making this extraordinary journey, Pompey followed his initial retreat as far as Colchis. He eventually decided that there was little reason to continue chasing him endlessly through the remote lands north and east of the Black Sea. Pompey apparently believed that Mithridates, deprived of his kingdom and pushed so far from Roman territory, would no longer be capable of returning to Pontus or organizing another major threat. Instead, Pompey turned his attention toward the Caucasus itself. The region fascinated educated Greeks and Romans because it was connected with some of the most famous legends of the ancient world. Colchis was traditionally the land of the Argonauts. The Dioscuri were associated with the region, as was Hercules. Pompey was especially interested in seeing the place where Prometheus was believed to have been chained to Mount Caucasus. The mountains were also famous for gold. Streams flowing from the Caucasus carried extremely fine particles of gold dust. Local inhabitants were said to place thick sheepskins in the water, so that the fleece trapped the tiny particles. This practice may have contributed to later attempts to explain the myth of the Golden Fleece associated with Aeetes and the Argonauts. Many local communities cooperated with Pompey as he moved through the region, but not everyone accepted the Roman presence. Oroeses, king of the Albanians, and Artoses, king of the Iberians, gathered a large force and prepared an ambush near the river Syrtis. Ancient accounts place their combined strength at around 70,000 men. The river flowed toward the Caspian Sea through a complex network of channels and received water from several major tributaries, including the Araxes. Pompey discovered the planned ambush before it could be successfully executed. He crossed the river by constructing a bridge and forced the opposing warriors back into heavily wooded country. This created a new problem. The local fighters were highly effective in forests. They used dense vegetation as cover, attacked unexpectedly, and avoided exposing themselves in open battle. Pompey responded with a ruthless but effective solution. Roman troops surrounded the forest and set it on fire. As the defenders fled from the flames, Roman soldiers pursued them. Eventually, the surviving forces surrendered, handed over hostages, and presented Pompey with gifts. These Caucasian campaigns later became part of the achievements celebrated in one of Pompey's triumphs at Rome. Among the captives and hostages, the Romans noticed a surprising number of women carrying wounds similar to those suffered by male warriors. This immediately reminded them of the ancient stories of the Amazons. Some believed these women actually belonged to an Amazon people living somewhere nearby and had joined the local armies. Others suspected that the populations of the Caucasus simply used the name Amazon for women who fought alongside men. The Romans never reached a definite answer. What was clear was that Pompey had driven Mithridates out of his traditional kingdom and extended Roman military power far beyond Pontus into regions where Roman armies had rarely operated before. Yet Mithridates himself was still alive. Far away on the northern shores of the Black Sea, he was already building new alliances, gathering resources, and imagining one final campaign against Rome. After completing his operations in the Caucasus, Pompey turned back toward Armenia. Tigranes had supported Mithridates and had refused earlier Roman demands, so Pompey now treated Armenia itself as an enemy power. His army advanced toward Artaxata, the royal capital, and the Armenian king quickly realized that another major confrontation with Rome could end disastrously. By this point, Tigranes was also facing serious problems within his own family. He had 3 sons by a daughter of Mithridates, and 2 of them had already died after turning against him. One had openly fought his father in battle and was killed during the conflict. Another met an equally grim end after a hunting accident. When Tigranes fell from his horse, the young prince supposedly made no effort to help him, and instead placed the royal diadem on his own head while his father still lay helpless on the ground. Tigranes later had him killed for this act of ambition. The 3rd son, also named Tigranes, initially seemed far more loyal. He showed concern after his father's hunting accident and was rewarded with a crown. Yet his loyalty did not last. Before long, he too rebelled, raised forces against his father, and was defeated. The younger Tigranes escaped to the Parthian king Phraates, who had recently inherited the throne. When Pompey began moving toward Armenia, the prince saw an opportunity. With Phraates' approval, he left the Parthian court and went directly to Pompey, presenting himself as a suppliant and potential ally. His decision carried an interesting irony. The young prince was himself a grandson of Mithridates. Even so, Pompey's reputation for keeping agreements and treating defeated rulers with a degree of fairness had spread widely throughout the East. That reputation soon influenced the elder Tigranes as well. Instead of preparing for another hopeless war, the Armenian king decided to surrender his fate to Pompey's judgment. He approached the Roman camp without formally announcing himself and without a large armed escort. Pompey sent senior officers and cavalry commanders to meet him as a gesture of respect. Many of Tigranes' companions, however, became nervous when they saw the Romans approaching. Unsure whether they had permission to continue, they turned back. Tigranes continued alone. When he reached Pompey, he submitted completely. According to one version, he threw himself before the Roman commander in the traditional manner of an Eastern ruler, acknowledging a superior. Another tradition claimed that Roman lictors formally escorted him into Pompey's presence. Whatever the precise ceremony, the meaning was unmistakable. One of the most powerful kings in the Eastern Mediterranean had come personally to accept Roman arbitration. Tigranes explained his previous conduct and offered an enormous amount of money. Pompey reportedly received around 6,000 talents from the king personally. The Roman soldiers were also rewarded. Each ordinary soldier received 50 drachmas, every centurion around 1,000, and each military tribune roughly 10,000. Pompey chose reconciliation rather than complete destruction. He forgave Tigranes for his earlier resistance and attempted to settle the conflict between father and son. The younger Tigranes was granted Sophene and Gordian, territories later associated with Lesser Armenia. His father retained the rest of the Armenian kingdom. Pompey also arranged that after the elder Tigranes died, his son would eventually inherit the larger Armenian realm. There was, however, a major condition. Tigranes had to surrender all territories he had conquered outside Armenia. This meant giving up the enormous imperial expansion he had achieved during the height of his power. Syria, from the Euphrates all the way to the Mediterranean coast, was surrendered. Tigranes also lost parts of Cilicia that he had previously taken from Antiochus Pius. The settlement temporarily appeared to solve the Armenian question, but the younger Tigranes soon created another crisis. Some Armenians who had deserted the elder king persuaded the prince to renew his opposition to his father. Pompey reacted immediately and placed the young man under arrest. The situation became even more serious when the prince attempted to encourage the Parthians to act against Pompey. He was therefore kept as a prisoner, later displayed in Pompey's triumph at Rome, and eventually executed. With Armenia apparently pacified, Pompey began acting as though the wider Eastern War was nearly finished. On the site of his earlier victory over Mithridates, he founded a new city called Nicopolis, meaning the City of Victory. It stood in Lesser Armenia and served as a permanent monument to the Roman campaign. Pompey also reorganized neighboring kingdoms. Ariobarzanes was restored to the throne of Cappadocia. Sophene and Gordiene, which had briefly been assigned to the younger Tigranes, were added to his territory. Several cities in Cilicia, including Kastabala, were also placed under his authority. Ariobarzanes later transferred his kingdom to his son while still alive. Over the following decades, the political arrangement changed repeatedly until, under Augustus, Cappadocia eventually became incorporated into the Roman imperial system. Pompey then crossed the Taurus Mountains and expanded Roman operations even further. He moved against Antiochus of Commagene, forcing him into an accommodation with Rome. Another ruler, Darius the Mede, also came into conflict with Pompey and was defeated. Ancient sources were uncertain whether Darius had supported Antiochus or had previously assisted Tigranes. Pompey next turned toward the Nabatean Arabs under King Aretas. He also intervened in Judea, where the struggle involving Aristobulus brought Roman forces directly into Jerusalem. The city, sacred above all others to the Jewish population, eventually fell under Roman control. At the same time, Pompey completed the incorporation of regions in Cilicia that had not yet accepted Roman authority. He reorganized Syria as well, extending Roman influence across Coele Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, Idumea, Iturea, and neighboring territories. The surviving Seleucid ruler Antiochus attempted to recover the kingdom that had belonged to his ancestors. Pompey refused. His reasoning was based on conquest rather than hereditary legitimacy. Since Tigranes had seized the Seleucid lands and Rome had now defeated Tigranes, Pompey argued that the conquered territories belonged to Rome by right of victory. While he was reorganizing the East, another dispute appeared between Armenia and Parthia. Representatives of both Tigranes and Phraates appealed to Pompey. Tigranes expected assistance as a recognized Roman ally, while the Parthians hoped to establish a stable diplomatic relationship with Rome. Pompey did not believe he had authority to begin a major war against Parthia without approval from the Senate. Instead, he sent negotiators to mediate between the two kings. While Pompey was reshaping the political map of the Near East, Mithridates was far from finished. The Pontic king had successfully completed his extraordinary journey around the Black Sea and reached Panticapaeum, the great trading city of the Bosporan kingdom. From there, he began rebuilding his position in Europe. One of his first acts was a brutal family punishment. Mithridates possessed a fortified treasury where large quantities of wealth had been hidden inside reinforced metal containers. The fortress had been entrusted to Stratonice, one of his wives or concubines. During the king's long absence, she surrendered the stronghold to Pompey. She also revealed the hidden treasure. Her only condition was that Pompey spare her son Xiphares if he ever fell into Roman hands. Pompey accepted the arrangement, took control of the money, and allowed Stratonice to retain her personal possessions. When Mithridates discovered what she had done, he sought revenge in the most vicious way available to him. He had Xiphares killed at the strait, while Stratonus watched from the opposite shore. The body was deliberately left without burial. By killing the son before his mother's eyes, Mithridates was punishing Stratonus indirectly for betraying him. Yet even after this act, the king continued trying to negotiate with Rome. He sent representatives to Pompey, who was still operating in Syria, and apparently did not yet know exactly where Mithridates had established himself. The envoys offered tribute in return for allowing Mithridates to retain his ancestral kingdom. Pompey demanded something much more humiliating. Mithridates would have to appear before him personally and make his request in the same way Tigranes had done. The Pontic king refused. He declared that as long as he remained Mithridates, he would never present himself personally as a submissive petitioner before a Roman commander. He was willing to send sons or trusted companions, but not himself. At the same time that he was negotiating, he was preparing for another war. Recruitment began throughout the Bosporan territories. Free men and slaves alike were enrolled into the army. Weapons, missiles, and siege engines were manufactured on a large scale. Timber was collected for military construction. Even agricultural animals were sacrificed to the war effort. Plow oxen were killed so that their sinews could be used in equipment and weapons. Taxes were imposed across the population, including on people who possessed almost nothing. The pressure became severe. Some of Mithridates' officials carried out collections with extraordinary brutality, sometimes exceeding what the king himself had ordered. For a period, Mithridates could do little to supervise them because he became seriously ill. Ulcers developed across his face, and he withdrew almost completely from public view. Only 3 eunuchs were reportedly allowed regular access to him while he received treatment. After recovering, Mithridates returned to the organization of his army. His core force eventually consisted of about 60 specially selected units, each numbering approximately 600 men. Around these stood many additional troops, as well as ships, fortified positions, and other resources accumulated by his commanders. The king then attempted to secure both sides of the Bosporan passage. Part of his army was sent across the strait toward Phanagoria, an important commercial center. The move immediately triggered rebellion. A man named Castor, who had previously suffered mistreatment at the hands of Trypho, one of Mithridates' powerful eunuchs, attacked Trypho as he entered the city and killed him. Castor then called upon the inhabitants of Phanagoria to revolt. The uprising spread rapidly. The city's citadel was already occupied by several children of Mithridates, including Artaphernes, Darius, Xerxes, Oxathres, and his daughter Eupatra. The rebels surrounded the fortress with wood and set it on fire. Faced with the flames, the royal children surrendered. Artaphernes was already around 40 years old, while several of the others were still relatively young. Another daughter, Cleopatra, refused to surrender. Her resistance impressed Mithridates so much that he immediately sent ships to rescue her. The operation succeeded, and Cleopatra escaped. But the rebellion at Phanagoria inspired other communities to abandon Mithridates. Chersonesus, Theodosia, Nymphium, and several strategically important Black Sea settlements joined the movement. The king now faced the same problem that had plagued him repeatedly throughout his career. Military pressure was being accompanied by political collapse. He began to suspect even his own army. Many soldiers had been recruited by force. Heavy taxation had created deep resentment. And after so many defeats, men were naturally reluctant to place their lives in the hands of a commander whose fortune seemed to be failing. Mithridates attempted to secure new support from the Scythian princes. He sent several of his daughters northward under the supervision of eunuchs, intending to marry them into powerful local dynasties. At the same time, he asked those rulers to provide military reinforcements as quickly as possible. About 500 soldiers from his own army accompanied the women, but the escort soon turned against the king's representatives. The soldiers had long hated the eunuchs, who possessed enormous influence within Mithridates' court. Once they were far enough from the king, they killed the eunuchs assigned to guard the princesses. Instead of delivering Mithridates' daughters to their intended Scythian husbands, the soldiers took them directly to Pompey. The defection was another sign that Mithridates was losing control. He still possessed soldiers, ships, fortresses, treasure, and the determination to continue the war. But the political structure around him was beginning to break apart from within. Pompey had defeated or subordinated kingdoms across the east and was reorganizing entire provinces under Roman influence. Mithridates, meanwhile, stood at the edge of the Black Sea preparing one last military effort, while cities, family members, commanders, and even his own soldiers increasingly abandoned him. By this stage, almost everything Mithridates had once possessed was slipping away. He had lost most of his kingdom, many of his fortresses, several of his children, and much of the loyalty that had sustained him through decades of war. His chances of receiving meaningful help from the Scythians were also fading. Yet none of this produced any real change in his character. Even now, with his power reduced to a fraction of what it had once been, he was thinking not about surrender, but about one final and astonishing offensive. His new plan was to move westward and seek support among the Gauls, with whom he had cultivated relations over a long period. From there, he imagined crossing into Italy itself. Mithridates hoped that Rome's enemies within the peninsula might join him once he appeared with a foreign army. The idea was inspired partly by earlier history. Mithridates knew how Hannibal had turned Italian discontent against Rome during the Second Punic War and how deeply that strategy had frightened the Romans. He also knew that only a generation earlier, many Italian communities had rebelled against Roman authority during the Social War. Even more recently, thousands had joined the uprising led by Spartacus. To Mithridates, these examples suggested that Rome's control of Italy might not be as secure as it appeared. His vision was therefore enormous. After rebuilding his strength around the Black Sea, he hoped to march through barbarian territories, connect with the Gauls, cross towards the Alps, and eventually descend upon Italy from the north. In his mind, the struggle that had begun in Asia could still end on Roman soil. His soldiers saw the matter very differently. They had already followed him through years of defeats, retreats, sieges, mountain crossings, and long campaigns across unfamiliar lands. Now they were being asked to leave the Black Sea region entirely and march toward Italy against the same enemy they had repeatedly failed to destroy closer to home. Many believed the expedition was hopeless. Some even suspected that Mithridates knew it was hopeless and wanted only to die in battle in a manner worthy of a king rather than spend his final years powerless and defeated. Yet they did not immediately revolt. Despite their fears, Mithridates still commanded a strange mixture of respect and intimidation. Even at the lowest point of his fortunes, there was nothing weak or insignificant about the way he carried himself. The decisive challenge came from inside his own family. Pharnaces, one of Mithridates' sons and the prince he had often treated as his likely successor, began plotting against him. His motives were probably mixed. Pharnaces may genuinely have believed that the proposed invasion of Italy would destroy what remained of the Bosporan kingdom. He may also have hoped that, by breaking with his father, he could obtain Roman recognition and preserve part of the dynasty for himself. Whatever the exact reason, a conspiracy formed. Some of the participants were discovered and arrested. Under torture, the plot began to come apart. Mithridates might easily have executed Pharnaces at that moment, but one of his advisors, Menophanes, persuaded him not to do so. He argued that war often produced reckless behavior even among close relatives, and that such tensions could disappear once the crisis ended. More importantly, Pharnaces was still the son Mithridates valued most. The king allowed himself to be persuaded and forgave him. It was a fatal act of mercy. Pharnaces understood that his father might change his mind at any moment. He also knew that large parts of the army hated the planned expedition into Italy. He therefore moved before Mithridates could reconsider. During the night, Pharnaces secretly approached the Roman deserters serving in his father's army. These men had especially strong reasons to fear the proposed campaign. If captured by Rome, their fate would almost certainly be severe. Pharnaces emphasized the dangers of marching thousands of kilometers toward Italy and promised rewards if they refused to follow Mithridates. They agreed. Once the deserters had been won over, Pharnaces sent agents to the neighboring camps. The conspiracy spread rapidly. By dawn, the Roman deserters raised a loud shout. Other sections of the army answered them. One camp after another joined the movement. Even sailors and naval troops eventually added their voices. Not everyone had been part of the original conspiracy. Some simply assumed that the revolt had already become too large to resist. Others followed because they had lost confidence in Mithridates. Once men realized that large sections of the army were turning against the king, remaining loyal suddenly seemed far more dangerous than joining the rebellion. Mithridates awoke to the noise and sent messengers to discover what his soldiers wanted. The answer was brutally clear. They wanted Pharnaces as king. They were tired of following an aging monarch whose court was dominated by eunuchs and whose own family had repeatedly died by his command. They wanted a younger ruler and an end to the desperate expedition toward Italy. Mithridates came out and attempted to speak directly to the army. His words no longer had the power they once possessed. Troops from one of the guard posts attempted to join the rebels, but the mutineers demanded proof that they were genuinely abandoning Mithridates. They pointed toward the king himself. Mithridates understood the implication and fled. Even his horse was killed before he could use it effectively. At almost the same moment, the soldiers acclaimed Pharnaces as their new ruler. They had no royal diadem ready for him, so one man reportedly took a broad leaf of papyrus from a temple and placed it around Pharnaces' head as a temporary crown. From an elevated position, Mithridates watched the scene. The army he had built was proclaiming his son king while he was still alive. He began sending messengers to Pharnaces, asking only for permission to leave safely. None returned. Mithridates now feared that his own son intended to hand him over alive to Pompey. For a man who had resisted Rome for decades, the thought of being paraded through the streets of the capital as a prisoner was unbearable. He thanked the small number of guards and friends who had remained loyal to him and sent some of them toward Pharnaces. Several were killed by the mutineers before they could even reach him. Mithridates then decided to die. For years, he had lived under constant fear of assassination by poison. Because of that fear, he had regularly experimented with antidotes and gradually accustomed his body to various toxic substances. Now he took poison that he habitually carried with his weapons and prepared to drink it. 2 of his daughters were still with him, Mithridates and Nyssa. Both were young, and both had been promised in marriage to powerful royal houses, one connected with Egypt and the other with Cyprus. They refused to let their father drink first. Instead, they insisted on taking the poison themselves. Mithridates finally allowed them to do so. The drug worked quickly on the 2 young women. They died beside him. Mithridates then drank the same poison. Nothing happened. He walked rapidly around the room, hoping physical activity might accelerate its effect. Still nothing. The precautions that had protected him throughout his life now prevented him from ending it. His long habit of building resistance to poison had made the method ineffective when he finally needed it. The irony was extraordinary. The king who had spent years protecting himself from poison was now unable to die by poison. Nearby stood a Gallic officer named Bituitus. Mithridates turned to him and asked for one final service. He reminded the Gaul that his sword arm had already served the king well against his enemies. Now, Mithridates said, that same arm could perform an even greater service. He asked Bituitus to kill him before the Romans could take him alive. Mithridates reflected bitterly that he had protected himself against countless poisons hidden in food and drink, yet he had failed to defend himself against what he now considered the deadliest poison found in royal households: betrayal by soldiers, children, and friends. Bituitus was deeply affected by the request, but he obeyed. With the stroke of a sword, the long reign of Mithridates VI Eupator came to an end. He was around 68 or 69 years old and had ruled for approximately 57 years, having inherited the kingdom while still very young. His ancestry was traditionally traced back through 16 generations to Darius, son of Hystaspes, one of the great kings of ancient Persia, and through 8 generations to the Mithridates, who had established an independent Pontic kingdom after breaking away from Macedonian domination. His reign had been extraordinary in both length and violence. He expanded Pontic power among neighboring peoples and brought several Scythian groups under his influence. For nearly 40 years, he fought Rome in one form or another. During those decades, he repeatedly seized Bithynia and Cappadocia and invaded Roman-controlled Asia Minor. His armies moved through Phrygia, Paphlagonia, Galatia, Macedonia, and other regions. At the height of his success, he also invaded Greece. For a time, his influence stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, and his naval forces operated from Cilicia toward the Adriatic. Then Sulla broke his power and forced him back into his ancestral kingdom. Ancient accounts claimed that enormous numbers of Mithridates' soldiers died during that phase of the war. Yet even after such a catastrophe, Mithridates rebuilt. That ability to recover became one of the defining characteristics of his career. He fought some of the greatest Roman generals of the late Republic. Sulla defeated him. Lucullus drove him from Pontus and invaded Armenia. Pompey finally destroyed his remaining strategic position. Yet Mithridates also inflicted serious defeats upon Roman commanders at different moments. He captured Lucius Cassius, Quintus Oppius, and Manius Aquilius. Aquilius, whom Mithridates regarded as one of those responsible for beginning the conflict, was eventually killed. Other prisoners were later returned during his settlement with Sulla. He also defeated or humiliated Roman commanders, including Fimbria, Murena, Cotta, Fabius, and Triarius. Few opponents of Rome survived so many reversals and still managed to return to war. Even after losing armies, cities, allies, and entire kingdoms, Mithridates continued looking for new ways to attack. He negotiated with the Samnites and Gauls. He established contact with Sertorius in Spain. He sought support from Armenia, Parthia, Scythia, and the Bosporan territories. He suffered wounds in battle and survived attempts against his life. Age did little to reduce his willingness to take risks. At the same time, his resilience existed alongside extreme cruelty. Members of his own family repeatedly became victims of his suspicions. Ancient tradition attributed to him the deaths of his mother, his brother, several sons, and several daughters. Those around him lived in a political world where loyalty could be rewarded enormously, but suspicion could bring immediate death. Physically, he was remembered as unusually powerful. His surviving armor was said to demonstrate his large build. Even late in life, he remained an accomplished horseman and could still throw a javelin while riding. Stories claimed that he could cover immense distances in a single day by repeatedly changing horses. He was also said to have driven a chariot drawn by as many as 16 horses. His interests were not purely military. Mithridates cultivated Greek learning and became deeply familiar with Greek religion and culture. He enjoyed music and participated in the broader Hellenistic traditions expected of an educated monarch. In many areas of life, he was described as disciplined, physically enduring, and capable of extraordinary hardship. His greatest personal indulgence, according to hostile ancient tradition, was his attraction to women. Thus ended Mithridates Eupator Dionysus, one of the most persistent enemies Rome ever faced. When news of his death reached the Romans, the reaction was one of celebration and relief. For decades, his name had been associated with recurring wars in the East. Now, at last, the enemy who had repeatedly survived Roman victories was gone. Pharnaces sent his father's body to Pompey at Sinope aboard a warship. Along with the corpse came important prisoners and hostages, both Greek and non-Greek, as well as men connected with earlier Roman defeats. Pharnaces then formally asked Pompey to recognize his position. Ideally, he wanted control of his father's former kingdom. If that was impossible, he was prepared to accept only the Bosporan realm that Machaerus had previously governed. Pompey treated the dead king with considerably more respect than might have been expected after decades of war. He paid for the funeral and ordered Mithridates to be buried with royal honors among the ancestral kings at Sinope. Pompey admired the scale of his achievements and regarded him as one of the greatest monarchs of his age, even though he had spent years fighting against Rome. Pharnaces was rewarded for ending the danger his father still represented. Pompey recognized him as a friend and ally of the Roman people and allowed him to rule the Bosporan kingdom. There was one important exception. Phanagoria was not returned to him. Pompey declared the city free and independent. Its inhabitants had been among the first to rebel when Mithridates was rebuilding his army and recovering military strength around the Black Sea. Their uprising had encouraged neighboring communities to defeat and had helped trigger the chain of events that ultimately destroyed Mithridates' last attempt at recovery. After nearly 4 decades of conflict, repeated invasions, revolts, sieges, alliances, and Roman counteroffensives, the Mithridatic Wars had finally reached their true conclusion. Mithridates had begun as the ruler of a regional kingdom on the Black Sea and had grown into one of Rome's most dangerous opponents. He ended as a fugitive king, abandoned by much of his army and overthrown by his own son. Yet even at the end, surrender had never become part of his plans. His final project was not escape or retirement, but an invasion of Italy itself. That refusal to accept defeat was the quality that made Mithridates so dangerous to Rome throughout his life, and it was also the quality that ultimately carried him toward his destruction. By the end of his eastern campaigns, Pompey had transformed Rome's position in the Mediterranean world. He had already swept piracy from the seas and dismantled the strongholds from which the pirates had operated. He then turned against Mithridates VI of Pontus, one of Rome's most persistent and dangerous enemies. Yet the war carried Pompey far beyond Pontus. His armies confronted peoples and kingdoms across the Caucasus, Anatolia, Syria, and the Near East, bringing him into conflict with the Colchians, Albanians, Iberians, Armenians, Medes, Arabs, Jews, and several other eastern peoples. By the time the campaigns ended, Roman influence had been pushed farther east than ever before. Egypt, however, remained outside Pompey's conquests. The Egyptian king had invited him to intervene in a domestic rebellion and attempted to secure his assistance with money, gifts, and even supplies of clothing for the Roman army. Pompey refused to enter the country. His reasons were uncertain. Egypt was still rich and powerful, and direct intervention might have created a dangerous new conflict. Pompey may also have been concerned about political opposition in Rome, where his extraordinary success was already creating jealousy among his rivals. Whatever his motives, he stopped short of adding Egypt to his victories. Pompey now faced the enormous task of deciding what should happen to the lands Rome had defeated. He did not impose the same political arrangement everywhere. Some communities were allowed to retain their freedom and became allies of Rome, while others were brought under direct Roman authority. Large territories were also entrusted to local rulers whose loyalty could help stabilize the region. This flexible settlement allowed Rome to dominate the East without having to govern every conquered territory directly. Armenia remained under Tigranes, while the Bosporan kingdom was entrusted to Pharnaces. Ariobarzanes received Cappadocia together with other territories connected to his kingdom. Antiochus of Commagene gained Seleucia and portions of Mesopotamia that had fallen under Pompey's control. In Galatia, Pompey recognized Diodorus and other local rulers as tetrarchs. Attalus was established in Paphlagonia, Aristarchus received authority in Colchis, and Archelaus was appointed to the prestigious priesthood at Comana, an office that carried considerable political as well as religious importance. Castor of Phanagoria was formally recognized as a friend of Rome. Through these appointments, Pompey created a network of dependent rulers whose power was closely tied to Roman support. His settlement of the East was not limited to kings, borders, and political offices. Pompey also founded new cities and restored communities devastated by years of warfare. In Lesser Armenia, he established Nicopolis, a city whose name celebrated victory itself. In Pontus stood Eupatoria, originally founded by Mithridates Eupator. Because the city had once welcomed the Romans, Mithridates had destroyed it. Pompey rebuilt the settlement and renamed it Magnopolis. Elsewhere, reconstruction followed conquest. Mazaka in Cappadocia, badly damaged during the fighting, was restored, while ruined or weakened towns across Pontus, Palestine, Coele Syria, and Cilicia received similar attention. Cilicia was especially important because Pompey had resettled many former pirates there after breaking their maritime power. Rather than simply executing or dispersing every captured pirate, he attempted to turn many of them into settled inhabitants. Soli became one of the most visible symbols of this policy and was eventually known as Pompeiopolis. The campaigns also revealed the extraordinary wealth accumulated by Mithridates. At Talara, one of the king's storage centers, Pompey's men discovered a remarkable collection of luxury objects. Thousands of drinking vessels were found, many made from onyx and decorated with gold. There were elaborate cups, drinking horns, wine coolers, couches, chairs, horse equipment, and other objects covered with precious stones and costly metals. The collection was so enormous that removing it reportedly required an entire month. Some of these treasures had histories extending far beyond Mithridates himself. Certain pieces were said to have originated with the Persian king Darius, while others had once belonged to the Ptolemaic royal house of Egypt. Cleopatra had deposited some valuables on the island of Kos, only for them eventually to fall into Mithridates' possession. Other objects had been commissioned or collected personally by the Pontic king, who had developed a reputation for surrounding himself with magnificent works of craftsmanship. When winter ended in 62 BC, Pompey rewarded the soldiers who had followed him through these campaigns. Each ordinary soldier reportedly received 1,500 Attic drachmas, while officers were rewarded according to their rank. Ancient accounts placed the total distribution at the astonishing figure of 16,000 talents. The scale of the payments reflected not only the wealth seized during the wars, but also Pompey's desire to reward the loyalty of an army that had carried Roman power across an immense territory. From there, Pompey traveled to Ephesus and prepared to return to Italy. His arrival immediately created intense anticipation in Rome. Yet one decision surprised many Romans. At Brundisium, instead of marching toward the capital at the head of a powerful personal army, Pompey dismissed his soldiers and allowed them to return home. At a time when successful Roman generals could use loyal armies as instruments of political pressure, this gesture eased fears that Pompey intended to seize power by force. News of his approach produced an extraordinary public response. Crowds left Rome to meet him long before he reached the city. Young men traveled the greatest distance, followed by groups of older citizens who went as far as they were physically able. Eventually, members of the Senate themselves came out to greet the returning commander. Pompey was no longer simply the general who had defeated Mithridates. He was returning as the man who had reorganized much of the eastern Mediterranean and carried Roman authority as far as the Euphrates. Rome rewarded him with one of the most spectacular triumphs in its history. The celebration was so vast that a single day could not contain it. For 2 consecutive days, the capital became a moving exhibition of Pompey's campaigns. Peoples from Pontus, Armenia, Cappadocia, Cilicia, Syria, the Caucasus, and the lands around the Black Sea were represented in the procession. The triumph was intended to show Roman spectators the enormous geographical scale of the victories achieved in Pompey's name. The wealth displayed was equally astonishing. Hundreds of captured ships were presented as evidence of his destruction of piracy and his victories at sea. Wagons and litters carried gold, weapons, ornaments, and royal treasures. Among the most impressive objects were items traditionally associated with great Eastern monarchs, including a couch said to have belonged to Darius. The throne and scepter of Mithridates were displayed before the Roman crowd, transforming the symbols of a once powerful king into trophies of Roman victory. One of the most spectacular objects was a gigantic golden representation of Mithridates himself, reportedly measuring 8 cubits in height. Tens of millions of drachmas in silver were displayed alongside it. Wagons carried captured weapons and the bronze rams of defeated ships. Pirates and prisoners also appeared in great numbers, but rather than being chained like ordinary captives, many were dressed in the traditional clothing of their homelands. The procession therefore became a living map of the peoples Pompey claimed to have overcome. Royal prisoners and prominent commanders formed another dramatic part of the triumph. More than 300 important captives and hostages were said to have appeared. Among them was the younger Tigranes, son of the Armenian king. 5 sons of Mithridates, Artaphernes, Cyrus, Oxathres, Darius, and Xerxes, were displayed together with his daughters Orsabaris and Eupatra. Ulthaces, a Colchian leader, was present as well, along with Aristobulus of Judea, Cilician rulers, Scythian female leaders, Iberian chiefs, Albanian commanders, and Menander of Laodicea, who had served as one of Mithridates' cavalry commanders. Those who could not be physically displayed were represented through images and scenes. The triumph recreated episodes from the wars against Tigranes and Mithridates, showing the kings fighting, suffering defeat, and fleeing from Roman forces. Mithridates' final days were turned into public spectacle as well. His desperate escape, his eventual death, and the fate of members of his family were all represented before the Roman population. In this way, Pompey's triumph did more than exhibit captured wealth. It transformed years of warfare into a carefully arranged story in which Roman victory appeared inevitable. A great inscription summarized Pompey's achievements in numbers and names. It announced the capture of hundreds of warships, the foundation of numerous cities, and the defeat of powerful rulers. Tigranes of Armenia, Artoses of Iberia, Oroeses of Albania, Darius the Mede, Aretas the Nabatean, and Antiochus of Commagene were among the rulers associated with his victories. The message was unmistakable. Pompey wanted Rome to understand that his campaigns had changed the political landscape of the entire East. At the center of the procession rode Pompey himself in a chariot decorated with precious stones. According to one remarkable tradition, he wore a cloak believed to have belonged to Alexander the Great. The garment was supposedly among the treasures that had passed into Mithridates' possession. Whether the story was true mattered less than its symbolism. Alexander represented the ultimate image of Eastern conquest, and Pompey's triumph deliberately invited comparison between the Macedonian conqueror and Rome's victorious general. Behind Pompey came the officers who had shared his campaigns, some riding horses and others proceeding on foot. The entire spectacle moved toward the capital, where Roman triumphs traditionally reached their ceremonial conclusion, yet Pompey departed from one of the darker customs associated with such celebrations. He did not order the mass execution of the defeated leaders who had walked before his chariot. Most were eventually sent back to their homelands at public expense. The royal captives were treated differently, and some met violent ends. Aristobulus was executed, while the younger Tigranes was killed later. Even so, Pompey's handling of the remaining prisoners distinguished his celebration from triumphs in which the humiliation of defeated enemies ended immediately in death. Pompey's return marked the high point of his public career. He had destroyed the pirate networks that had threatened Mediterranean trade, defeated the kingdom of Mithridates, crossed into the Caucasus, reorganized territories from Anatolia to Syria, created new alliances, founded and rebuilt cities, and pushed Roman influence deep into the East. His triumph turned these achievements into one enormous political statement. For 2 days, Rome watched the wealth, Rulers, weapons, ships, and symbols of distant kingdoms passed through its streets, while Pompey presented himself not merely as a victorious commander, but as the architect of a new Roman order in the eastern Mediterranean. The defeat of Mithridates VI brought an end to a struggle that had dominated Roman affairs in the East for roughly 40 years. What had begun as a conflict with the powerful king of Pontus eventually transformed the political map of the eastern Mediterranean. By the time the fighting was over, Rome had secured Bithynia, Cappadocia, and much of the territory surrounding the Black Sea, while its influence reached far beyond the lands that Mithridates himself had once controlled. The momentum of the war carried Roman armies into regions that had not originally been part of the conflict. The remaining independent areas of Cilicia fell under Roman authority, while Syria, Phoenicia, Coele Syria, Palestine, and territories stretching inland toward the Euphrates were drawn into Rome's expanding sphere. Some of these regions began paying tribute almost immediately, while others were incorporated more gradually. In either case, the destruction of Mithridates' power opened the way for Rome to establish itself permanently across the Near East. At the same time, territories that had temporarily escaped Roman control during the wars were recovered. Paphlagonia, Galatia, Phrygia, Mysia, Lydia, Caria, Ionia, and other parts of Western and Central Asia Minor once again came under Roman influence. Greece and Macedonia, which had also been threatened or occupied during Mithridates' campaigns, were restored to Roman control. Several communities that had previously enjoyed a degree of independence now found themselves paying tribute to Rome. The scale of these changes explains why the Romans remembered the conflict as something far greater than an ordinary provincial war. It had lasted for decades, involved an extraordinary number of peoples, and repeatedly threatened Rome's position throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The final victory was celebrated accordingly, and Pompey emerged from it with the title Magnus the Great. His reputation rested not simply on defeating one king, but on completing a war that had repeatedly survived Roman attempts to bring it to an end. Mithridates had been an unusually formidable opponent. At the height of his power, his fleet could number more than 400 ships. Ancient accounts also credited him at various moments with armies containing tens of thousands of cavalry and enormous bodies of infantry, supported by siege engines, missiles, and extensive military equipment. Whether every ancient figure should be taken literally or not, there is little doubt that the resources available to the Pontic king were immense. His strength also came from his ability to build alliances. The Armenian monarchy supported him, as did rulers and tribal leaders from the regions surrounding the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. His diplomatic reach extended toward the Thracian Bosporus and beyond. Mithridates understood that defeating Rome required more than winning battles in Anatolia. He therefore tried to connect his struggle with almost every major crisis threatening the Roman Republic. During Rome's civil conflicts, he maintained contact with Roman leaders who were themselves fighting against the government or against rival factions. He also looked toward the disturbances in Spain and attempted to coordinate his interests with enemies of Rome there. Even the peoples of Gaul entered his calculations. Mithridates considered building alliances with them so that he might eventually approach Italy from the north, opening an entirely new front against the Romans. The Mediterranean itself became another weapon in his strategy. Piracy spread across the sea on an enormous scale, particularly from bases connected with Cilicia. Pirate fleets disrupted communication between cities, attacked shipping, interfered with commerce, and contributed to serious shortages of food. What might otherwise have remained a regional war therefore affected merchants, sailors, coastal communities, and populations far removed from the main battlefields. Mithridates was attempting something extraordinarily ambitious: to surround Rome with instability. Rebellion, piracy, diplomacy, military alliances, and direct warfare were all parts of the same broader struggle. From the eastern Mediterranean to the western provinces, Rome faced enemies whose activities could potentially reinforce one another. Few opponents of the Republic had ever attempted to coordinate resistance across such a vast geographical area. Yet the strategy ultimately produced the opposite result. Instead of driving Rome from the east, the wars gave the Republic the opportunity to extend its authority farther than before. When the struggle began, Roman power in the region remained uneven and vulnerable. When it ended, Roman influence stretched deep into Asia Minor and the Near East, reaching the Euphrates. A conflict designed to weaken Roman expansion had instead accelerated it. The war was also unusually difficult to describe as a simple sequence of isolated campaigns. Fighting in Pontus could be connected to events in Armenia, piracy in the Mediterranean, political upheaval in Rome, rebellion in Spain, or diplomatic activity around the Black Sea. Many events occurred simultaneously and influenced one another. The Mithridatic Wars were therefore not merely a confrontation between Rome and Pontus, but a network of interconnected conflicts stretching across much of the Mediterranean world. The death of Mithridates did not immediately bring peace to his former territories. His son Pharnaces II inherited ambitions of his own and attempted to rebuild power around the Bosporus. One of his early targets was Phanagoria. He placed the city and nearby communities under such intense pressure that hunger eventually forced the inhabitants to leave their defenses and confront him in battle. Pharnaces defeated them, but instead of destroying the population, he chose negotiation. He accepted hostages, reached an agreement with the inhabitants, and withdrew. This combination of force and conciliation allowed him to strengthen his position without wasting resources on unnecessary destruction. For a time, it appeared that the son of Mithridates might succeed in rebuilding at least part of his father's shattered kingdom. His ambitions soon expanded into Anatolia. Pharnaces captured Sinope and then turned his attention toward Amissus. Rome, however, was passing through another enormous internal crisis. Pompey and Julius Caesar were fighting for supremacy, and Roman commanders in the east could not always respond effectively to local threats. Pharnaces recognized the opportunity and moved aggressively while Roman attention was divided. His expansion brought him into conflict with the Roman commander Calvinus. At first, the unstable political situation worked in Pharnaces' favor. Yet his position was also threatened from within his own sphere of influence. Asander, one of his enemies, challenged his authority and forced him away from parts of Asia. Pharnaces was therefore caught between Roman resistance and a struggle for control of his own kingdom. The situation changed dramatically after Julius Caesar defeated Pompey and became involved in Egypt. Returning from the Egyptian campaign, Caesar turned toward Pharnaces. The confrontation took place near Mount Scotius, in a region already associated with earlier Roman defeats during the Mithridatic Wars. Pharnaces was now fighting on ground connected to his father's victories, but the result would be very different. Caesar defeated him decisively. Pharnaces escaped with only about 1,000 cavalrymen and retreated toward Sinope. Caesar had more urgent political and military problems elsewhere and could not devote much time to pursuing him personally. Instead, he entrusted the task to Domitius. With his position collapsing, Pharnaces negotiated the surrender of Sinope. Domitius permitted him to leave with his cavalry, but Pharnaces made the surprising decision to kill the horses before departing. His own soldiers strongly objected, yet he carried out the order and abandoned the region by sea. The destruction of the horses prevented them from being seized or used by his enemies, but it also deprived his men of one of their greatest military advantages. Pharnaces returned to the Bosporus and attempted once more to rebuild his fortunes. He recruited forces among the Scythians and Sarmatians and succeeded in capturing Theodosia and Panticapaeum. Even after his defeat by Caesar, he was clearly unwilling to abandon his claim to power. Asander, however, confronted him again. This time, Pharnaces' army suffered from a serious disadvantage. Without sufficient cavalry, many of his soldiers were forced to fight on foot, a form of warfare to which they were poorly accustomed. Their effectiveness declined sharply, and Asander's forces gained the advantage. Pharnaces continued fighting even as his army collapsed around him. Ancient tradition portrays him resisting fiercely until wounds finally brought him down. He died at approximately 50 years of age, after ruling the Bosporan kingdom for around 15 years. With his death, the last serious attempt by the immediate family of Mithridates to recreate the old Pontic power came to an end. The Bosporan kingdom now entered another period of political change. Caesar initially granted authority there to Mithridates of Pergamum, a man who had provided valuable assistance during Caesar's Egyptian campaign. Rome increasingly treated the region as part of a larger political system in which local rulers could survive only with Roman approval. Pontus and Bithynia themselves became firmly connected to Roman provincial government. Roman officials were regularly sent to administer the territories, making clear that the political independence once enjoyed by the kingdoms of the region was disappearing. The age of Mithridates, in which a powerful Anatolian monarch could challenge Rome as an equal, was effectively over. Caesar also had to decide what to do with the rulers whose positions had originally been guaranteed by Pompey. Many of them had supported Pompey during the civil war, giving Caesar every reason to distrust them. Nevertheless, he generally chose stability over widespread punishment and confirmed several rulers in their existing territories. One important exception concerned the prestigious priesthood at Comana. Archelaus lost the office, and Caesar transferred it to Lycomedes. The decision demonstrated how thoroughly Roman political power now reached into institutions that combined religious authority, landholding, and regional influence. Even positions rooted in local religious traditions increasingly depended upon Roman approval. The process continued under the generation that followed. Territories assigned to various kings and dynasts by Caesar or Mark Antony did not remain permanently independent. Under Augustus, many of these lands were gradually converted into Roman provinces. Local rulers might survive for a time, but Rome increasingly preferred direct administration whenever political circumstances provided an opportunity. By then, the consequences of the Mithridatic Wars could be seen on an enormous geographical scale. Roman authority extended from Spain and the Pillars of Hercules in the far west across the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and the Euphrates. To the south, Roman influence reached the lands bordering Egypt. What had once been a collection of scattered possessions was becoming an interconnected Mediterranean empire. North Africa had already undergone a similar transformation. Roman possessions extended toward Cyrene, which had entered Roman hands through the will of its ruler, Appian, a member of the Ptolemaic royal family. This gave Rome control over yet another major section of the Mediterranean coastline. Only Egypt remained outside the growing circle of Roman-controlled territory. Surrounded by regions increasingly dominated by Rome, the Ptolemaic kingdom stood as the last major independent power, preventing Roman authority from enclosing almost the entire Mediterranean. That situation would not last much longer. The wars against Mithridates had already pushed Roman power toward Egypt from several directions, while later civil conflicts would draw the kingdom directly into Roman politics. Once Augustus finally absorbed Egypt, the Mediterranean would become, in practical terms, a Roman sea. The significance of the Mithridatic Wars therefore extended far beyond the destruction of Mithridates himself. The conflict began as a dangerous challenge to Roman authority and developed into one of the great turning points in Rome's eastern expansion. Decades of fighting brought enormous destruction, piracy, rebellion, and political instability, but they also gave Rome opportunities to intervene in territories where its presence had previously been limited. Mithridates had spent much of his life trying to prevent Roman domination of the East. Ironically, the struggle he created helped produce exactly the world he had fought against. His resistance drew Roman armies deeper into Anatolia, the Caucasus, Syria, and the Black Sea region. After his defeat, Rome did not withdraw. It remained, reorganized the conquered territories, supported dependent rulers, established provinces, and gradually absorbed the remaining kingdoms. For Rome, the war ended not simply with the defeat of an enemy, but with a dramatic expansion of imperial power. For the kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, it marked the beginning of a new political age, one in which even rulers who retained their crowns increasingly did so beneath the shadow of Rome.